Sitting in a bleak, anonymous airport, slouched back, tired from an intense week of teaching and training at a conference, I tolerate the suitcases stacked on either side of my legs as other travelers join me, unified in our common desire, all begging to hear our boarding call to go home. Across the aisle, a young girl in her early 20s plops down, sliding her backpack onto the floor, pulling out a cell phone to read what I assumed would be dozens of messages from her wired world. This scene plays out hundreds of times a day as I travel, so I don't pay attention, ignoring the chatter and hubbub around me. A minute or so later, I glance up. Something is horribly wrong with something she read. I keep an eye on her reactions as I see her read, gasp, read more, and then hang her head as if to say, I give up. She is in distress, shaking, rubbing her temples, rocking quietly. I don't know what to do, if anything. I'm not sure what I should do. I'm a stranger in an airport. Do I speak to her? Do I reach out? Do I look away? Feign ignorance? Silently decline involvement? After all the other passengers are minding their own business. I should as well. Something was wrong. I couldn't ignore it. I slip across to the empty seat next to her as tears cascade down her cheeks. She wipes her eyes. I quietly murmur, I couldn't help but see something has upset you. Is there anything I can do to help? I hoped she wouldn't be frightened or scream for security. She doesn't. She sniffles and again wipes her eyes. With a small voice, she says, I just found out my little nephew reached up to turn on the TV and he accidentally... She struggles, pauses, begins again. He reached up and accidentally pulled the TV down on top of himself. It killed him. He was only 3 years old. She begins to cry again. I don't say anything. I don't try to hold her hand or make any advance. After a few moments of silently sitting, I simply say, I'm very sorry. Very sorry. We sit, and after a bit she shares what he was like and how much fun he was and how this is such an awful, awful piece of news, just as she is flying home on college break. I hand her a clean, white handkerchief from my back pocket. Again, silence. I hope my presence is enough. A few minutes pass, and I see her stir, look around, and say, They're calling my plane. Okay, I say. I lean in a bit closer. When you are on your flight, know that I will be thinking about you and your nephew, and I hope you will feel a measure of peace. She looked up and said, Thank you. I stand, take hold of my bag, and walk away. I stop a dozen yards away and lean against the wall, looking back as she takes her place in line to board her flight. In that moment, I feel an elephant of pain, a deep anguish stepping on my chest as if taking on her torment myself. In that moment, I share her agony, and I almost can't hold up as breathlessly I weep, my head laid low. Her pain, my pain, this stranger, this young girl who lost such a young, innocent loved one. I shouldn't care, but I do, with depths equal, as if it were my own flesh and blood, inexplicably lost to the stupidity of tragedy. I cry. It's not a getting older thing. It's I feel things deeply thing. I feel deep feelings. I'm sure others do as well, but for me, empathy and loss have deep connections to my soul. I didn't cry at my dad's funeral for my loss. I felt my mother's loss as we sat in the memorial service, watching pictures of the man she had made her life for 52 years flash across the screen. She felt loss. I bore her suffering in that moment. When I think about my kids, specific thoughts about their young lives and the pain I caused through my divorce, I pause, my eyes well up. I value their lives so much, and I bear the guilt of causing memories of distress. I tell them I love them, but they don't comprehend the indebtedness I feel that now they have chosen to enjoy hanging out with me as we are multi-generational adults. I cry when I write them letters expressing my value for them. I feel deeply. A local pastor had a Sunday morning music and prayer request show on the radio station I owned. Reverend Kilgore was a faithful man in his ministry and his ever-present weekly radio show. I would pop my head in the studio and say, "You're sounding good, sir," which would be followed by his consistent reply, "And you're looking good, Mr. Steve." He died. I was asked to give a eulogy. I sat home thinking about his faithfulness, his steadfastness, and I wrote, and I wrote, and I cried. I needed to cry then, so when I presented my message at the memorial, I could clearly communicate the value of his life to me. As I left the podium, I laid my hand on his casket and said, "Welcome home, sir. Welcome home." I felt the loss for his family and congregation. Crying for me has not often been an expression of joy or an overwhelming positive experience. It's most often about taking on the pain of others or the pain of loss. If I did cry out of happiness, it's because I'm happy for someone else who is overwhelmed. Television stories of family reunions, tales of triumph over the odds, movie characters who survived the onslaught, the choir bells directed by my cousin Carol can all bring me to tears. I feel deeply. I saw a fallen soldier return home, exiting the rear of the airplane, his or her casket borne by a comrade in arms, and I cried for the pain of the parents, friends, loved ones who must endure the coming days, weeks, and lifetime of a pain that will not heal. I do cry as well in the joy of a returning service person running into the arms of family and children, joy overflowing, but it's always sharing in the exaltation of others. Crying for me is intertwined in other people's lives, their pain, their joy. I rarely have cried for myself. I've cried in absolute frustration, being told over and over, "You're not good enough. You're not living up to God's law. I'm glad your grandmother isn't alive to see this." My worst, most inconsolable washing of tears came when my grandpa on the farm, as we called him, Alfred Kittleson, died. The day of the funeral, I could not withstand the devastating loss torn from my life. I could not bear standing idly by in the funeral home waiting for the funeral to begin. I walked and walked and walked around the city park until the last minute before the service was to begin. Then I struggled, gritting my teeth, upholding an unbearable burden, holding back until day turned to night and we were driving home. Only then did I weep from such depths that I could not stop, the low guttural moan of death retching away the one person who helped me survive my childhood, the only one who gave me value to keep living those many years ago. My second worst episode was the torment after a contentious family court case. When failing to receive any support from the judicial system, I didn't know if I'd ever see my kids again. Afterward, there were deep, hurtful, lost sobs echoing as I sat in my car, my head pounding against the steering wheel. My father sat next to me in silence, staring straight ahead. No emotion, no word of comfort, nothing. Years later, when I told my young son returning from war how much he was valued and loved, he heard the struggle of my voice, and as my composure waned, he reached out, placed his hand on my shoulder. "I know," is all he said. Even a child knows to connect, to share in momentous times. My grandmother cried when I left after a long visit, helping with her husband who had suffered a stroke. She missed me even before I left, and I felt tears of value coming from her well-worn face. I feel deeply. When people have succumbed to a depth of emotion that draws them down in heartache or rockets them upward in joy, I share in their journey. I do cry. I want to cry. I want to feel the depths, even when it's difficult. It creates an awareness, a connection to the world outside my own existence. I want to feel deeply every day.